My name is Diana Martin, and I was born and raised in Boston, America, in a house that always seemed bigger on the outside than it felt on the inside. It was a bungalow, an old building with ivy crawling along the side, and a maple tree leaning against the porch like a weary friend. To everyone else, it was a symbol of our family's pride. To me, it was a shell of memories, some sweet, many bitter. My father, Robert, would often say, "This house is our legacy, Diana," as if the roof and bricks were more important than the people living inside. My mother, Helen, liked to polish the floors and talk about the glory of our family name, though I could never see the glory she bragged about. My older sister, Marilyn, however, basked in all of it, like she had been born for the applause that seemed to follow her around. The day of Marilyn's birthday was a spectacle, as everything about her seemed to be. The bungalow was packed with relatives, neighbors, and family friends. People came in their best clothes, carrying neatly wrapped gifts and smiling as though they were attending a coronation. My father had hired a jazz trio from New York, their instruments filling the living room with a smooth hum of celebration. There were flowers on every table, food in every corner, and glasses of champagne being carried around as though we were the wealthiest family in Boston. In truth, the food was bought on credit and the musicians were paid in installments, but no one needed to know that. All anyone cared about was the show, and my father was a man who loved his show. I stood near the back of the room, holding a glass of sparkling water and trying to blend into the wallpaper. That night was not about me, and I knew better than to make it so. I watched as Marilyn floated through the crowd in a silk blue dress, her hair pinned up like she was the star of a movie. Everyone adored her. Her smile, her laugh, her effortless way of making each person feel special. I had learned long ago that she didn't have to try very hard. People wanted to love her, and so they did. When the time came for gifts, the room grew silent with expectation. My father, standing tall with his chest puffed out like a proud rooster, held a small velvet box in his hand. He called Marilyn to the center of the room, where the jazz stopped and every eye turned. With a flourish, he opened the box and revealed a shiny golden key. To Marilyn, he declared, his voice rich with pride, "I give you the family mansion on Beacon Hill. It is yours now. May it be your crown, your castle, your inheritance." The crowd erupted in applause. Marilyn gasped and pressed her hand to her chest as though she couldn't believe it. My mother threw her arms around her. The air was thick with congratulations, laughter, and joy. The mansion, our so-called jewel, was a 3-story building in one of Boston's wealthiest neighborhoods, valued at nearly $2.5 million. It was the kind of gift people dreamt of, and my sister had received it like it were the most natural thing in the world. And then, 2 weeks later, it was my birthday. The scene was almost the same. The jazz band, the guests, the lights. But the air was different. Less charged, less excited. As if everyone knew there would be no grand surprise for me. I wore a simple black dress and stood quietly by the window. I didn't expect much, and perhaps that was my strength. Still, a small piece of me, a younger, more foolish piece, hoped that for once I might be seen. My father stood before the crowd again, this time holding a flat frame wrapped in paper. He beckoned me forward. My heart pounded harder than I wanted it to. He smiled at me, not a warm smile, but one he wore for show. He pulled away the paper to reveal not a key, not a deed, not even a piece of jewelry, but a simple magazine clipping of a house taped inside the frame. "This," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "is the house of your dreams." And then he laughed. The laugh was sharp, jagged, and it cut deeper than any insult ever could. Around him, others joined in, neighbors, cousins, even family friends who should have known better. They chuckled, some nervously, some fully entertained, while I stood frozen with the frame in my hands. My cheeks burned, but I forced myself to stay calm. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I didn't throw the frame back at him, though every bone in my body wanted me to. Instead, I smiled faintly, nodded, and whispered, "Thank you." The laughter slowly died, and the band picked up their instruments again, filling the silence with a tune that did nothing to fill the hollow pit inside me. I walked back to the corner of the room, placed the frame against the wall, and sipped from my glass. My sister, radiant as ever, floated toward me for a moment and touched my arm. "It's just a joke, Diana," she said lightly, though her eyes carried no real kindness. "Don't take it so seriously." I smiled back and replied, "Of course not." But inside, I felt something awaken. Something cold, sharp, and resolute. The night dragged on, with music and chatter and the sound of champagne glasses clinking together. I remained silent, watching as people danced, laughed, and pretended to be close to us. I noticed how my parents glowed with satisfaction, basking in their power to give or to withhold, to raise one child on a pedestal and laugh at the other. I realized then that silence could be sharper than laughter, that stillness could be stronger than noise. As the guests left and the lights dimmed, I carried the frame upstairs and laid it on my desk. I stared at it for a long time. A picture of a house, taped inside glass. My father thought it was a joke, but to me, it was something else entirely. It was a reminder of how little they thought of me and how much they underestimated me. I knew a truth that none of them knew, not my father, not my mother, not even Marilyn. The truth was written on a piece of paper I had kept hidden in a folder inside my desk drawer. The deed to the very bungalow they were living in, signed by my grandmother and sealed by the county clerk. The bungalow was mine. It had been mine since the day my grandmother passed, though no one had bothered to ask. And so, as I lay in bed that night, listening to the quiet creak of the maple tree outside my window, I promised myself this. Tomorrow, I would no longer be silent. Tomorrow, they would see the strength behind my quiet. Tomorrow, I would remind them whose house they were truly living in. For years, they had laughed at me. But tomorrow, the laughter would end. Sleep refused to visit me that night. I lay awake in my room, staring at the ceiling where shadows from the maple tree danced against the plaster. The laughter from the evening still echoed in my ears. My father's sharp tone, the chorus of guests joining in, the way my mother had smiled at the joke as if it were harmless. But it wasn't harmless. It was cruel. And I had taken it in silence, as I always did. Yet something inside me was shifting, like an old gear finally clicking into motion. At dawn, I rose quietly, unwilling to disturb the stillness of the house. I made myself a cup of tea, letting the warmth steady my hands, then went to the drawer where I kept a set of folders, my private archive, receipts, savings records, copies of letters. And tucked inside a brown envelope, yellowing at the edges, was the document I had kept hidden since I was 19. It was the deed to the bungalow, signed and notarized, sealed with the county stamp. My grandmother, Margaret, had left it to me. She had trusted me. On the day she slipped that envelope into my hands, she had whispered, "You have a steady head, Diana. Keep this safe. Someday you will need it." I had not known what she meant, but I kept it anyway, as carefully as one might guard a treasure. Now I understand. With the deed in my hand, I dressed, pulled on my coat, and left the house. The air in Cambridge was crisp, carrying the smell of coffee shops opening their doors and bakeries laying out bread. I walked into a copy shop just as the clerk was lifting the blinds. The place smelled faintly of ink and warm paper. My voice didn't tremble when I asked for copies. The man behind the counter glanced at the document, raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He slid the papers back to me, crisp and clean. I added one more page, a letter written in sharp, simple words. Vacate the premises within 30 days. Title in my name. Deed attached. I signed it with my full name, Diana Margaret Martin. The copies cost me $2.50, and I placed the receipt in my wallet with care. As I stepped out into the morning sun, I felt taller, as though my body finally matched the weight of the truth I had carried for years. When I returned to the bungalow, my parents were still in their clothes from the night before. My father sat in his chair, his tie loosened, a smug satisfaction still lingering on his face. My mother was sipping cold coffee, looking tired but content. They barely glanced at me when I entered the kitchen. Without a word, I placed 2 envelopes on the table. "Please read," I said simply. My father smirked. "What's this now? A birthday card you forgot to give me?" He tore open the envelope with dramatic flair, clearly expecting some harmless trinket. His eyes skimmed the words. At first he chuckled, but then his brow furrowed. The color in his face drained as he reached the second page, the deed. His hand shook slightly as he read the county stamp, the record number, the unmistakable legal weight of it. This must be a mistake," he muttered, his voice thinner than I had ever heard it. "It is not a mistake," I said calmly. "Grandma left the bungalow to me. You never asked. You never checked. You just assumed it was yours." My mother leaned forward, snatching the paper from his hands. She read quickly, her lips pressing tighter with each line. When she finished, she looked at me with wide, startled eyes, as though she had seen a ghost. "Diana, why didn't you tell us?" she whispered. "Because you never cared to ask," I replied. My voice was even, but inside I was trembling. Not with fear, but with a release of something that had been trapped for years. The house fell into a silence, so thick it felt as though even the maple tree outside had stopped moving. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat down across from them, and waited. The notice did all the speaking for me. I didn't need to shout, didn't need to justify. The truth was already printed in black and white. By noon, word had spread beyond our walls. Marilyn, my sister, was one of the first to call. Her voice was sharp, full of disbelief. "Diana, is this some kind of joke?" she demanded. "No, Marilyn," I said. "The joke was the picture frame. This is the truth." She went silent for a moment, then hissed, "Do you realize what you're doing to our family?" I almost laughed at the irony. "I'm simply taking what was mine all along," I answered, and I hung up before she could spit another word. Neighbors whispered. A few relatives called. The same people who had laughed at me at my birthday party now lowered their voices to gossipy murmurs. I let them twist the story, let them speculate. None of it mattered. For once, I was the one holding the pen, and they were merely reading from the pages I had written. That afternoon, I began to pack. My room, once the smallest and most overlooked in the bungalow, became a flurry of boxes and bags. I folded clothes into neat piles, stacked books in careful order, and placed keepsakes into a single suitcase. It was not much. I had never been one to collect more than I needed. I had lived simply, quietly, while my sister demanded the world. When I opened my desk drawer, I counted my savings. $8,400, every dollar saved from years of steady work at the publishing office, every extra shift, every bit I had refused to waste. I slipped the cash into a plain envelope, along with my passport and my grandmother's letter. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, though I knew it was not the weight of paper, but the weight of choice. I sat on my bed and stared at the boxes. A strange peace settled over me. For the first time in my life, I felt control, not the illusion of control, not the scraps of attention tossed my way when convenient, but real, solid control. The kind you can touch. The kind you can claim. Downstairs, my parents were whispering. I caught pieces of their conversation. Fear, denial, anger. My father raised his voice once or twice, but it never reached me the way his laughter had. Their voices were distant, muffled, fading. I realized then that they were already part of my past. As evening fell, I stood by the window, looking out at the maple tree that had grown with me since childhood. Its branches swayed gently, as though nodding approval. Tomorrow would bring more conflict, more apologies perhaps, maybe even more laughter at my expense. But none of it mattered anymore because tonight, I had taken the first step. The house was mine. The truth was mine, and the silence I had carried for years had finally been broken. That evening, after the weight of the notice had sunk into the walls of the house, my parents came to find me. I was sitting in the living room, a lamp glowing softly beside me, my hands folded over my knees. For once, I did not move when they entered. I did not rise to meet them, did not bend myself to their moods. I simply waited. My father's voice, once so sharp and commanding, was small. "Diana," he said, "we're sorry. We didn't know. We were blind." His words wavered as though spoken through cracked glass. My mother stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm. She nodded, her face pale. "We should have treated you better," she added, softer, almost pleading. I looked at them both. For a moment, I thought I saw them not as parents, but as two ordinary people, flawed, fragile, frightened. And yet, the memory of their laughter the night before still burned in me like a fresh scar. I thought of the picture frame, of the clipped magazine house, of the guests who had laughed at my expense. A joke worth nothing, handed to me like an insult. "I accept that you are sorry," I said slowly, my voice steady. "But you must leave. The notice stands." Their faces shifted, disbelief hardening into resistance. My father's temper rose, his voice sharp again. "You can't mean this. This is our home. We raised you here." "No," I said, standing at last. "You raised yourselves here. You raised Marilyn here. But me? You mocked me here. You ignored me here. And now, the law is clear. The deed is in my name. You are guests in a house that belongs to me." Shouting filled the room, his, not mine. My mother's voice joined his, desperate, tangled with pleas and excuses. But I did not shout back. I had no need. The papers had spoken for me, and the truth did not require noise. When the shouting subsided, I walked to the phone and dialed Maya, my friend in Chicago. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and alive. "Diana, what's going on?" "I heard something from Marilyn, something about lawyers." I told her everything, from the birthday humiliation to the notice I had delivered. I did not embellish, did not dramatize. I told it as it was, and Maya listened without interruption. When I finished, she exhaled sharply. "You did the right thing," she said firmly. "And listen, you can come stay with me. No rent, no strings. Just come. We'll find you a place of your own." Her kindness felt like a lifeline thrown across a storm. "Thank you," I whispered. That night, I sat at my desk and booked a one-way ticket to Chicago. $179, a small price for freedom. As the confirmation email arrived, I felt the first true smile rise on my lips in days. The next morning, I called a real estate agent. His name was Thomas Reed, a brisk man with a steady handshake and eyes that scanned every detail of the bungalow like a hawk. Within hours of listing, offers began to pour in. People adored the porch, the maple tree, the storybook look of the old home. One offer stood out, $612,000, the highest by far. I accepted it without hesitation. On the day of closing, I walked through each room slowly, as though bidding farewell to ghosts. The living room where I had once read quietly while my family entertained guests. The kitchen where my mother had smiled more at Marilyn's chatter than at my silence. My bedroom, small and tucked away, was where I had dreamed of escape long before I knew it was possible. I touched the walls, pressed my hand against the window frame, and let the memories settle into their corners. Whatever pain the house had held, it had also sheltered me. It had been my refuge in its own quiet way. I whispered, "Thank you," to the empty air. On the kitchen counter, I placed the keys and a folded note. In my neat handwriting, the words were simple: "A home is not a prize. It is a promise." With my suitcase and 3 boxes stacked neatly by the door, I called a cab. My parents hovered nearby, watching in silence, their faces marked with the realization that no apology could undo what had been done. I did not look back at them. Some doors, once closed, are meant to stay closed. The cab driver loaded my things into the trunk. As the bungalow faded behind me, I felt no tears prick at my eyes. The plane lifted into the air later that evening, and as Boston curved away beneath the clouds, it looked less like home and more like a chapter turned. I sat by the window, my hands folded in my lap, my suitcase tucked beneath the seat. For the first time in my life, I felt light. Not because the past was erased, it never would be, but because the weight of silence had finally lifted. As the engines roared and the city disappeared, I thought of the new beginning waiting in Chicago. A new house, perhaps a new street, a new chapter that I would write for myself. And I knew, with certainty, that this was not the end of my story. It was the break. The clean, sharp break that comes before rebuilding, and I was ready. When the plane touched down in Chicago, I felt like I had landed in another version of America. Louder, faster, sharper, but also strangely honest. The air was different here, brisk and restless, filled with the scent of the lake and the clang of the trains. From the moment I stepped onto the sidewalk outside O'Hare with my 3 boxes and my suitcase, I felt lighter, as if Boston had slipped off my shoulders. Maya was waiting for me. She waved from the curb with her big smile, bundled in a scarf, holding a cardboard sign that said Queen of Deeds. I laughed out loud for the first time in weeks. She hugged me tight, and for a moment I thought, this is what family should feel like. Not obligation, not ridicule, but care freely given. Her apartment was small but warm, tucked above a bakery that always smelled like cinnamon. That first night, she made soup and we stayed up until midnight talking. She asked me everything, and I told her everything. She didn't flinch when I told her how my father had laughed at me, or how the guests had joined in. She didn't say, don't take it so seriously. She said, that was cruel, but you survived it. The next morning, she handed me a spare set of keys. Stay as long as you need, she said. I promised her it would not be long. I had no intention of living on someone else's kindness, even hers. I wanted my own space, my own key and my own lock. During the first week, I bought a pair of strong boots for $120 and learned which bus route followed the lake. I walked through the downtown streets, the tall glass towers reflecting the sky like mirrors, the hum of the L train rattling above me. I felt small but not invisible, just one life among millions, free to make my own way. Maya and I began the hunt for my new home. We scrolled listings, toured apartments, and peeked into condos. Some were too small, some too cold, some too grand for what I wanted. I was not searching for another mansion, not a stage for people to applaud themselves on. I wanted a house that breathed quietly, that waited for me without judgment. On the 3rd Saturday, we found it. It was a brick house in Lincoln Square, tucked on a quiet street lined with trees that bent low in the wind. The house had ivy climbing up its walls, a narrow yard where I imagined planting herbs, and a door painted deep green. Something about it made me pause. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't enormous, but it looked alive. It looked ready for someone to choose it. The price was $485,000. It was more than I had planned, but between the sale of the bungalow and my savings, it was within reach. I paid a deposit of $24,000 that very week. A month later, the papers were signed. The house was mine. Walking through those empty rooms for the first time, key in hand, I felt something I had never felt before. Peace. No tension in my shoulders, no weight pressing against me. Just space, quiet, waiting mine. I bought a second-hand couch for $300, a sturdy oak table for $90, and hung a framed print of a map of America and Europe on the living room wall. I wanted those 2 shapes in my home, symbols of where I stood and what I could dream of, 2 words I could say without hesitation. On the first night, I sat on the floor with takeout pizza and whispered into the emptiness, "This is the house of my life." And then I laughed, not cruel, not loud, just free. In time, I began to build a circle. At work, I met Bobby, a kind man who fixed printers and never made jokes at anyone's expense. He had a quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. We had coffee by the river and talked about books, about music, about the simple things. Through him, I met his sister Lucy, who owned a small bookstore and laughed like a bell. She introduced me to poetry I hadn't touched since college. And of course, there was Maya, still anchoring me with her warmth. The 4 of us began to gather often. We went to free concerts by the lake, tried cheap diners with neon signs, and once we started a little tradition, each of us put £5 into a jar and called it the Brave Fund. That jar sat on my kitchen counter, reminding me that courage can be as simple as saving for something unseen but certain. Letters arrived from my parents. Some were pleading, some apologetic, some angry. They wanted to visit, to talk things through. I never opened them. They sat in a drawer unopened, because a boundary is a door you keep shut, and I had learned the difference between forgiveness and permission. Neighbors began to stop by. They noticed the ivy, the deep green door, and the way I planted herbs in the narrow yard. They asked about the maple cutting I had placed in a pot by the window, a piece of the old tree I had taken from Boston before leaving. When people came in, they looked around and said, "This feels like you." I would smile and tell them a story. Not the whole story, but enough. I was once handed a picture of a house as a joke, but I answered with a deed. I was mocked, but I turned silence into strength. I bought this house, not as a prize, but as a promise to myself. They would nod, sometimes with tears in their eyes, because even if they didn't know the details, they understood the truth, that life is not about what is given to you, but what you claim for yourself. Now, every morning, I rise early. The light slips across the table and glows against the map of America on the left, Europe on the right. I make my coffee, water the herbs, and count my small joys. Bills get paid on time, not out of duty, but out of pride. I don't wait for applause anymore. I don't need keys handed to me by anyone. The house is mine. Life is mine. The voice is mine. And when I stand at the green door each evening, turning the key, I remember this. Once, I was the quiet daughter, overlooked and mocked. Now, I am the woman who writes her own ending.